hyperpartisanship isn't just something for the right. There's a significant amount of on the left too. Do you see any green shoots here with people on the left starting to realize that maybe being so hyperpartisan isn't such a good idea, or are we just stuck in, battle mode? Hello out there in podcast land. Welcome to a new edition of the Liberal Patriot podcast. I'm your host, Rui Teixeira. We come at you every couple of weeks with the very finest and heterodox conversation analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today I'm happy to have John Avlon here. John is a candidate for the Democratic nomination in New York's 1st Congressional District in Eastern Long Island. And John actually has a long and storied career in politics and journalism, most recently at CNN. So, John, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about your evolution of your career and how you came to, as it were, throw your hat into the ring?
Sure, it's great to join you. I am an unabashed fan of the work you all are doing at the Liberal Patriot. I think it's exactly where we need to be. So it's a real pleasure. I left CNN, where I've been a senior political analyst and anchor for the last 5 years, to run for Congress. Ran and got out in February. Before that, I was editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast, a longtime columnist, and the author of a few books, including Independent Nation, which is my first book, How Centrists Can Change American Politics. Then I wrote Wingnuts, How the Lunatic Fringe is Hijacking America. Then a book called Washington's Farewell, about George Washington's farewell address and its relevance to our times. And then most recently, Lincoln and the Fight for Peace. And I think, and this is one of the reasons I feel such common cause with what you all are doing. I think to some extent, for my entire career as a journalist, as an author, as an anchor, and as an analyst, where I did my reality check segments on CNN, I should say, I have been basically taking on the same challenge from different angles, which is the dangers of hyperpartisanship and polarization to American democracy, and ideas on how we can overcome those forces and reunite the nation. That's what's inspired and animated my work from different angles, whether it's taking on, playing offense from the center against extremism and wingnuts, drawing on, I think, the best traditions of American history and the lessons we can draw from history in my last two books and in my columns and on Reality Check. And so to some extent, I feel that this run for Congress here on Long Island is a real continuity of that sense of purpose. I found it incredibly invigorating to get in the arena. I personally didn't feel like I couldn't bring myself just to talk about this election. I think the stakes are far too high, as you and your listeners well know. And I wanted to do something about it. This is a time for doing, not talking. And I felt I could make the biggest difference by running for Congress and flipping a seat held by a first-term Trump-Publican who's far too far right for the district. And kind of put the ideas that we all talk about in action and see if they work in practice. And I've been incredibly inspired by the reaction we've gotten.
Well, that's great. Leaving aside the issue of how you'll beat your opponent, eventually, if you get the nomination, you got to beat Nick LaLota, if I'm pronouncing that right. And he won the district by 11 points in 2022.
It's narrower than it seems.
It's a bit of a challenge, right?
Well, all politics is local, as Tip O'Neill famously said. This district is traditionally a swing district, the east end of Long Island. This is for folks who know Long Island is Huntington to Montauk. It's a vast cut of Suffolk County. It's a swing district. It has evolved from being very conservative once upon a time. Bill Clinton brought it into the Democratic field in presidential years. It was represented by a legendary Democrat named Otis Pike for many years, but most recently Tim Bishop, who held it for 12 years. He was then defeated by Lee Zeldin, who I always like to say his full name should be Lee Zeldin, who voted to overturn the election after the attack on the Capitol. I think everyone who did that.
Last name, man. We'll see if it,
you know what? I think those are the hyphens that need to be. No one gets to live that one down in my book. Mm-hmm. And this was one of 18 districts that Joe Biden won. Mm-hmm. That is held by a Republican representative. Nick LaLota is a first-term Republican. And basically the history of the last couple of elections in this district, a guy named Perry Gershon, who was supporting our campaign, ran against Lee Zeldin in 2018, came within 4 points. Then Nancy Goroff, who is my current primary opponent, and the primary is June 25th. She was the nominee in 2020, voted for her, wanted her to win. She self-funded to a very large extent, spent $8 million.
But she ran badly, right?
She ran 10 points behind Joe Biden at the top of the ticket.
Mm-hmm.
And that obviously, that doesn't speak to the trend of the district. That I think does reflect on the appeal of that particular candidate. And then in 2022, Bridget Fleming, who is wonderful, Suffolk County legislator, was my legislator. Again, someone I'm honored to have her support. She had a very tough race because Kathy Hochul was running against Lee Zeldin for governor. And so the Democrats, I think, sort of felt that, their resources were best spent elsewhere rather than in Zeldin's home district. And so she did in that race, lose to Nick LaLota by a similar number, that Nancy Goroff had done 2 years before. But the reason I say all of that is if you don't understand the inputs, you'll misunderstand the outputs. And really, elections are driven by, first of all, what's the cycle? Presidential cycles are going to have far and away the highest turnout. And this was a district Joe Biden narrowly won. And Nick LaLota is the first of the Trump Republicans who represent a district Biden won to go out and enthusiastically endorse Donald Trump. I'll tell you a couple other things about the district. And this one in particular, you and your listeners will appreciate. There are more registered independent voters in New York 1 than any other district in New York State.
Interesting.
Right? And particularly someone of our politics who understands you got to fire up the base, but reach out and win over independent voters. We need to build broad coalitions. And then there are only 3,000 more registered Republicans than Democrats. So this is a majority maker district. Before I got in, one of the reasons I got in was I was frustrated at seeing the swing district not being taken seriously as a pickup opportunity because I think folks assumed that, we might do Goroff again. But once I got in the race, all of a sudden we were back on a target list map. And I think that speaks to, just candidates matter. Tom Suozzi.
Talk about Suozzi because he's kind of a model, right, for what you're trying to do.
He absolutely is. He absolutely is. And I just saw him earlier today. He's someone who we have very similar approaches to politics and policy. But what he showed us, and I got in the race just days after, he won his special election in New York 3, the seat that he had held, and then George Santos held briefly, the disastrous con that he is. And he won by 8 points. And I think Tom Suozzi reminded us of a couple of things. First of all, the narrative that Long Island was going inevitably red was wrong. Candidate quality matters. That's one thing that Tom Suozzi reminded us. The second thing is playing offense on the issues people care about matters. Democrats, I hear this constantly, are really frustrated. They always seem to be on defense, right? Terribly afraid of offending, tiptoeing around. And worse, when people say they're concerned about crime or migrants, there's an impulse to sort of shift into denialism. And I believe we need to have fact-based debates, and we need to play offense from those fact-based debates. But don't make it sound like you're gaslighting people if they feel concerned about an issue. Offer a solution that's consistent with our values that shows you take the issue seriously. Seize the center of the electorate. I know this is chapter and verse to you and your listeners.
Mother's milk, man.
But it's not to everybody. And I think that's part of the fundamental problem of how we've gotten in this mess. And Suozzi, I think Suozzi was also enormously helped by two other things that I appreciate and understand and associate myself with. One, try as they might, Republicans tried to run the cookie cutter, carbon copy sort of attack that he was dangerously liberal, that he was the far left. Wasn't credible, right? They couldn't get traction on it. There was just nothing they could do. There was no defund the police sign that Tom Suozzi had in his back catalog. He'd been an effective county executive, very pragmatic, problem-solving kind of guy. Been a member of Congress, so they couldn't play that switch on him. The other thing was, and I think this is really important, is that right before the special is when Donald Trump pulled the plug on the bipartisan border security bill that Republicans had asked for. Just do some quick history for folks to remember. Democrats Joe Biden, Barack Obama have all campaigned on comprehensive immigration reform. George W. Bush tried to get it done. McCain and Kennedy worked on it. There was briefly, of course, that Republican Gang of Eight, and then it dissipated because Republicans decided that Eric Cantor lost his special election because he was weak on immigration, which, by the way, is totally tenuous and not necessarily supported by the facts. So Republicans held aid to Ukraine. I think this is something that will be condemned in history's eyes, the 6-month delay that occurred. But that they delayed aid to Ukraine, Israel after the attacks of October 7th, which is just horrific. And we can talk about that later. And Taiwan, under threat from China, they held that up and said, no, we don't want comprehensive immigration reform. We want to tie it to a border security standalone bill. Democrats said, okay, we think it needs to be comprehensive, but Chuck Schumer and Chris Murphy, Kristen Sinema worked with Senator James Lankford from Oklahoma, a very conservative guy, but someone who is smart and a man of his word. And they came up with what the Wall Street Journal said was the toughest border security bill anyone would ever get, even if Trump was president. But Trump doesn't want that problem to be solved. He doesn't want bipartisanship to get credit. He doesn't want Biden to get credit. So he pulled the plug on it. And then the party did what they do. The Republicans fell in line. They reversed their position on the issue. They decided to come up with all sort of fictional reasons why they wouldn't support it. And it was a disgrace. And Nick LaLota, by the way, fired off a tweet saying, my 9-year-old could have done a better job negotiating this border bill than James Lankford. Right? Didn't need to pile on, just decided to do it because it's the kind of guy he is. But Tom Suozzi at that moment was able to say, see, they want to fearmonger off a real issue. They want to fundraise off this issue, but they won't fix it. Right. And I think that's a firing offense. And I think that was the other thing that really helped Tom, in addition to the fact that he's a great politician who's a common sense, centrist Democrat like myself. And so he won by 8 points. And so that, I think, changed the narrative around Long Island. And then I was able to, I'd already decided to run and left CNN, but announced a few days later. So I think that's one of the reasons there's a lot of optimism, enthusiasm, and intensity around our campaign.
Yeah, now, I mean, the sort of Suozzi was able to take advantage of the bipartisan bill being shot down and trying to turn it back against the Republicans a lot because he was willing to, he had a record of pretty tough rhetoric and a sort of tough position on immigration and on illegal immigrants, and he even talked about them committing crimes. I mean, he did and said a lot of things that for people in the Democratic Party left is anathema, right? I mean, just the kind of thing you should never say, because we Democrats don't talk about immigrants in that way. I mean, famously, Joe Biden, after his State of the Union address, wound up apologizing, referring to an illegal immigrant as illegal. So it seems like the hegemonic attitude toward the issue of illegal immigration is still pretty left, even though they did manage to put that bill together. So why do you think this is going to fly in your district, given the fact that the issue hasn't been resolved? Biden keeps on talking about how he's going to or we hear from the White House, maybe they're going to do something about using executive authority to close the border, but it ain't happened yet. So, I mean, I think this is the plan, such as it is, at least right now, will try to run against the fact that the Republicans tanked a pretty good border security bill. But I just wonder if for most people that really is going to be that convincing. I mean, I think Suozzi handled it really well, but is that truly generalizable? I guess I'm asking.
Yes, absolutely, particularly if your opponent was part of the problem, not part of the solution. Mm-hmm. We got to flip the script. Look, they lost the right and the ability to say that they take this problem seriously. Mm-hmm. They folded. They caved because their boss told them to, and they abandoned their principles, their conscience, their common sense at the door. We're serious about solving the problem, and we know the real way to do it is comprehensive immigration reform. And let me tell you the way I talk about this. Okay. First of all, I'm the grandson of immigrants. That's enormously important to me because my patriotism, my belief in American civic religion comes from the fact that their example, their pursuit of the American dream, their understanding that American democracy is precious and can't be taken for granted, that all was something that I grew up understanding and appreciating on a very deep level. It has everything to do with why I care so much about the country, why I'm an unabashed patriot and think we need to make sure we take the American flag back, because no party gets to say they own that. Why I write history books, why I think we need to make the old stories new again, all these things. I say that because I understand that immigrants make our country better, economically and culturally. But here's the key point. Here's the topic sentences going back to my days as an editor-in-chief.
Okay.
We need more legal immigration and less illegal immigration. We need more legal immigration and less illegal immigration. And that shouldn't be controversial. That should be common sense. And Democrats know that the best way to do it is comprehensive immigration reform. Heck, everybody knows. And this is what frustrates folks. Because the real disruption we need to see brought to Washington is from the status quo that knows how to solve a problem, but finds a lot of convenient short-term excuses for not fixing it. Because they're afraid of what elements of the base might say. They put the perfect, the enemy of the good. They frankly enjoy fundraising off it, and they have a vested interest on some level in the status quo. That's not sustainable. We need to have immigration reform passed because we absolutely need to stop the politics of demonizing immigrants. They're the renewable secret to our success. And comprehensive immigration reform would bring the dreamers online, would give people a pathway to citizenship, would increase the H-2A and H-2B visas that farmers absolutely depend upon, that temporary workers that our economy depends upon. It's good for the economy. It's good for our country. It's good for our culture. And yes, as part of that, we need to strengthen border enforcement even further than it's been done to date. Because if people don't believe the laws are being respected, not only, and you write about this a lot, people feel like, hold on, I did it the right way. How come they aren't? And by the way, there are a lot of short-term fixes beyond the executive order that we can do, that Congress can do, right? So if part of the problem is that the asylum process is broken, because this is a sacred thing. America gives amen to that. Look, I feel deeply purposeful and patriotic about the ideal and purpose of asylum. America should be a welcoming place, a beacon of freedom, where people who are afraid of political persecution that puts their lives and their family lives at risk, we want to welcome those folks. But that is not the same thing as economic asylum. And we have blurred those two. And we've also done something that has compounded the problem. We and the Republicans had an opportunity to help fix this, and they haven't yet. Hire more judges to adjudicate these claims. It is crazy that folks wander around the country for 6-7 years waiting for their claim to be heard. Right? Let's apply. If you believe, as I do, that basically human nature doesn't change, that's the reason we study history, then look at the incentive structures the systems are putting in place. And then adjust it, fix it. If people don't feel like they can simply say a magic sentence, get in the country, do their own thing for a couple of years, benefit their family economically for sure, and then get their hearing, well, let's adjust that incentive structure. Let's hire enough judges, Republicans and Democrats, to adjudicate these claims in a speedy manner. And let's make sure asylum is being used for what it should be used for, which is the absolutely critical work of ensuring that families whose lives are at risk because of political persecution have a home here in America.
Yeah, dare I say it, that seems just like, common sense.
I'm a common sense
curiosity, John, are you calling, I mean, is part of your platform on this, do you call for Biden to use his executive authority right now to close the border?
I've got policy statements. I mean, look, you know me. I've got columns about this issue and reality checks going back decades, for better or worse. It's not really hard to figure out where I stand, nor do I believe it should be. Right? We shouldn't, we need to be authentic to who we are and what we believe, and also understanding that there are issues people are going to evolve on over time. I'll talk about one of those in a little bit with you. But I think that Biden should use his executive authority, because that gives you a certain degree of flexibility. But everyone needs to understand that executive orders are not lasting solutions.
No, for sure.
The devil's in the details. But there's no case where the border can be porous. That's in nobody's actual interest at the end of the day.
Yeah, boy, obviously I agree. What's holding the Democrats back then from, embracing a more common sense approach? Because it does seem like a no-brainer to some extent. I'm
very careful about, I'm happy to debate someone's judgment, not their motives, and that requires me getting inside their head, and I don't want to make that assumption. I think one can intuit in understanding politics that there's always a fear of offending some, organized group or another at a time, especially in an election. We're trying to make sure everyone is fired up. But I remember doing a piece in the 2020 election about Spanish language disinformation in Florida, and it was prevalent, and it was all calling Democrats, the Biden-Harris team, socialist dictators in waiting, right? That old trope.
Yeah.
Which only been good, but also take it seriously. If your family's immigrated to the United States from Central or South America, or really any place, particularly in the last 100 years, the odds-on chance in many cases your family was fleeing communist persecution, right? Or some form of a socialist or strongman. And by the way, this is where horseshoe theory applies. So let's not, this isn't just about the left, right? Particularly for folks in the time when Ortega is ruling Nicaragua as a dictator, as he did before with the Sandinistas, and I've got not a lot of patience with the people who came up with ornate excuses for the Sandinistas the first time around, but now it's even more apparent and less defensible. The enormous destruction to Venezuela, and all of a sudden, so. Condemn that. Biden administration State Department's been actually pretty good on Nicaragua, right, in particular, right? But make it clear. No apologies on this stuff. But then there was a certain pushback I found in my reporting that the people were afraid of maybe offending, members of the DSA if they called out the Spanish language disinformation with that.
The DSA, that mighty electoral powerhouse, yes?
Right.
Like questionable calculus.
Don't get off defense. If you've got, look, it takes two wings to fly and we all need big tents, but figure out where the common ground is, but stand up for liberal values consistently. Mm-hmm. That's the way out of so many of the thickets we find ourselves in politically. You think about your first principles, think about your values, stand up to illiberalism wherever it goes, and don't make an apology for it.
Yeah. Well, zooming out a little bit here,
Sure.
John, what do you think about the Biden campaign at this point? I mean, how do you think it's going? I mean, I think fair reading of the data, it looks like Trump's in a pretty strong position, maybe slightly favored. How on earth does this happen? I mean, we're running against
I actually.
So what's the deal?
I actually think that Biden is in a stronger position than he seems, or at least Democrats are. And I'll give you a couple of reasons why. First of all, if there's ever been moral clarity and moral urgency around an election, it's now. And there are a lot of countervailing forces, particularly hyperpartisan, ecosystems and fragmented media markets and frankly, disinformation galloping around on places like TikTok that we now see that, pro-Trump propaganda is outpacing, pro-democratic messages, and that seems to be happened at roughly the same time that China and Russia have made it very clear via their own disinformation that they would vastly prefer Donald Trump because that's investing in American decline. None of us should get numb to the fact that there's never been a major party nominee campaigning on an authoritarian platform praising dictators. That's not consistent with anything resembling American values. Now, the Joe Biden is old, but he is a decent and good man, and he has been a consequential and effective president in my eyes. Perfect's never on the menu. On the other side is a man who's already shown that he's a threat to our republic because he tried to overturn an election on the back of a lie. And one political party has rallied around him out of fear, some combination of careerism and cowardice, to allow that lie to become a litmus test for party loyalty. That ultimately does not reflect American values. It ultimately does not attract independent voters. It ultimately, I think Democrats can pick up between 10 and 15, maybe 20% of Republicans. Because if you're a Reagan Republican, a constitutional conservative, a Bush 41 Republican, everything Donald Trump represents is the opposite of what you allegedly believe. So it's a question about teamism. It's a question of putting country over party and making that appeal. And also Democrats, I think, if you look at the fact that the Democratic Senate candidates are running ahead of Biden, that shows two things. First of all, it shows that Biden is not inspiring and galvanizing. But it also is hard for me to believe that people are going to vote for a Democratic Senate candidate and Donald Trump for president. The economy is improving. It is improving unequally. It's not happening fast enough. I want to make that really clear that, the affordability is still the number one issue I hear. And the number one issue I think Democrats need to focus on and we need to focus on as a country is rebuilding the middle class. To me, it is not an accident that we've seen the middle of our politics hollowed out at the same time that we've seen the middle of our economy hollowed out. And that's a whole of government effort. But the infrastructure bill and the CHIPS Act are important steps toward that.
And bipartisan steps, too.
And bipartisan. The other thing is that you talk to many independents or people in the center, their number one value is bipartisanship. I did a reality check about this a couple of years ago. The odd fact is that bipartisanship has become, by and large, a partisan value. And you can do it statistically. Okay. Over the first 2 years of the Biden administration, when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker, with a very narrow, no margin in the Senate and a similarly narrow margin in the House, over 300 bipartisan bills were passed. Over 300. This Republican-led do-nothing Congress is so preoccupied with fighting themselves that the Speaker of the House needs to get bailed out by Democrats to get anything done in the national interest because the far right is too busy attacking itself in a circular firing squad. So, I think it's hard to make an argument for getting reelected when you've been able to do nothing but fighting instead of fixing things. And Democrats have a real record of bipartisanship. And it's just borne out in the polling as well. Democrats always say that they want a presidential nominee who can reach out and work with the other side. And Republicans say they want someone who can play to the base and fight for their interests. So I think there's a delta there that we can build upon. There are a lot of challenges for the Biden campaign going forward. I don't want to minimize those.
Yeah. Well, what do you think they should do differently than they're doing, if anything? I mean, you're arguing they're in a stronger position than
conventional wisdom would suggest.
So, but yeah.
Well, first of all, my favorite apocryphal Abraham Lincoln quote is, "I'm an optimist because I don't see the point in being anything else." I think that there's a fashionable or there's a contagious exhaustion and feeling of sense of overwhelm that's utterly insufficient to the times we face. And as someone who writes history, studies history, at these critical moments that are genuinely dangerous in America, defending our democracy, the people who are overwhelmed by the scale of the challenge don't end up doing any good. It's the people who are defiantly optimistic who rally together to get something done. Action is the best antidote to despair and exhaustion. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think Democrats need to make a broader case that this is a time to build a broad patriotic movement to defend American democracy. As my friend Adam Kinzinger says, this is about building a coalition of the sane center right, what's left of it, the sane right, what's left of it, the center and the left. And this is why Liz Cheney's going to go around the country and campaigning for Democrats. And I've been so inspired, and I think this is part of the reason I love the title of the Liberal Patriot. I think it's a good brand, especially for folks on what liberal values actually are, as distinct from, any mob of a given moment that's associated with a political movement at the time that distracts from consistent application of liberal values. When I go to Democratic town committees, and I've been really inspired by the fact that I've gotten the endorsement of 6 out of 8 Democratic town committees here in New York, one ahead of the primary. That's unprecedented. But when I go to the meetings, they begin with a Pledge of Allegiance. My first Democratic town committee in Huntington, the day I declared, I went and the state party chairman, Jay Jacobs, was there, and he began with a moment of silence for Alexei Navalny. There is more outrage at our fellow democracies, particularly Ukraine, being left to swing in the wind in the face of Putin's aggression because of Republicans' refusal to stand with our allies and fellow democracies. This represents what used to be known as sort of a Cold War liberalism for the 21st century. That consensus that was key to making America the strongest it's ever been on the world stage as well as at home. There's also a focus on the need to rebuild the middle class. And that's one of the things I think we need to rediscover and really embrace.
Talk a little bit about that. I mean, how exactly would that work? I mean, I know this is talk about oldies but goodies. Democrats have been talking about rebuilding the middle class for a long time.
Particularly Joe Biden, by the way.
Do that, what would...
You're at a great think tank, and I appreciate heterodox thinkers. I like people who are, showing that they're using their conscious, their common sense, and not thinking about, teamism and political tribes first. But I've been struck by this. For all the think tanks in Washington, there are very few. There are increasingly a couple of initiatives that I think are worth paying close attention to, focused on how to rebuild the middle class. Now, there are a couple of the ideas that are out there are sort of more redistributionist solutions, which I don't think are practical given the American system. Democrats need to think more about how to use market forces, not fight against market forces. Let's have the wind at your back. But there are things we can and should do. Some are short-term solutions, some are near-term, some are long-term. Here on Long Island, and this is the subject of a new ad we just put up on air a few days ago, but this is a core issue, is the fact that Donald Trump and the Republicans raised our taxes by taking away the state and local tax deduction. Right? For over 100 years, you could deduct your state and local taxes. People say, wow, that was unfair. No, it was fair. And let me tell you why. As Senator Moynihan famously pointed out, New York and most blue states give more to the federal government in taxes than we get back. And red states, particularly the Deep South, from Kentucky to Mississippi, get more than they give. And then they rail against the federal government. So this is an issue of fairness, but it hurts folks where they live and adds to the frustration they feel. So I'm working with a CPA, and we did the math on a family of four in Smithtown, and it's a hypothetical family, but let's say in this case that the father's a plumber, the mother's a school teacher, and they've got two kids. Combine them, they make around $190,000 a year. They would get almost $4,000 back if the full SALT deduction was restored. That's real money. Add to that if we expand the child tax credit, which we did for 1 year during the pandemic, and cut childhood poverty in half.
Those were the days.
Cut childhood poverty in half. That's something that we can do that's real to make it a little bit easier for the countercultural activity of raising kids in America today. Those are things we can do. Republicans will talk about it. They'll say, I'm fighting my own party on state and local tax deductions. But guess what? Their party is Heisman to them every single time in every single way. Why? Republicans are invested in the red state, blue state divide in this Trump era. They like it. They want it. But those tax cuts are, as everybody should know, is due to expire in 2025. And if we have Hakeem Jeffries as Speaker of the House from New York, and Chuck Schumer, majority leader, I hope, we will be in a position to negotiate that back. And getting the child tax credit done is something we also need to do. Let's talk about midterm. Infrastructure Bill and CHIPS Act, reshoring essential manufacturing. It's a no-brainer. It's important. It's overdue. It will help rebuild the middle class. And let's look about the things that built the great American middle class in the first place, which, by the way, was built here on Long Island. Unions, the GI Bill, and community colleges. And I think, unions have an incredibly important role to play. People who are members of unions make around 10% more than they would otherwise. And particularly with the rise of AI, I think unions can be more important going forward, not less. I think the GI Bill can be expanded. I think I'm one of these people. I've written an essay with Jonathan Haidt and Maya McGinnis called the Unum Test, about how we can reunite the nation, thinking about not just political reforms, which I used to be primarily focused on, frankly, but also the economic and cultural dimensions. And one of the things we say is if there was an expanded definition of national service, in exchange for forgiveness of your college or university debt loans, that could be not just military service, but it can be working in local government, hospitals, the Park Service, Teach for America, a really expansive vision. That would help bring people together outside their particular red state, blue state, urban, rural, which, as you've written about many times, and I've said as well, is the real underlying issue. It's not red state, blue state, it's urban, rural. And actually allow people to devote themselves a part of their life to public service in exchange for something meaningful. Bring people together to reinforce that idea that we have degraded in recent years, but was preeminent in the post-war years under Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy, the idea of the common good. Right? Yeah. To some folks, that sounds vaguely socialist. It's not.
Yeah. What you mentioned unions. Do you think the Democrats have really dropped the ball over time and not pushing more for like labor law reform? I mean, it is still way too difficult to organize unions. It's great that Biden's out there supporting unions, but ultimately 6% union density in the private sector, ain't a lot to write home about. So we really need to change the system a bit, don't we?
Yeah, but don't roll your eyes at that, right? I mean, Joe Biden stood in a picket line. He's been, by the way, go back to his 1988 campaign, and he was talking about the middle class and unions more than almost any other candidate at that time. He was saying, like, there's a downside to Reaganomics boom we're seeing, that a lot of cities like Scranton or Youngstown, Ohio, where my mother is from, were getting hollowed out. A lot of these manufacturing hubs, particularly sort of not just in the Midwest, but even in the Northeast, been hollowed out by those policies. And that took a real toll out of the middle class. And it not coincidentally, hurt union membership. But David Leonhardt's book about the rise and fall of the American dream is absolutely worthwhile reading. I recommend that. And I think you spoke to him in one of your first interviews.
Absolutely. And I recommend the book as well.
It's a great book. It's a great interview. I'll put a plug for your own podcast on your own podcast. Go back to the deep cut.
I love it.
And listen to that one. Because it really is a great distillation of the themes of the book. I do think that Democrats need to make sure that working families and middle-class families understand that they're doing the hard work of trying to expand or to restore the American dream and make sure it feels viable. And as David pointed out, and to some extent, this is about the belief that America is a place where your children will do better than you will outside their own mistakes and excesses. Part of the and we need to put an emphasis and measurement on social mobility and make sure that people who work hard and play by the rules can work their way into the middle class and beyond. But that needs to be a real source of strength, and we need to be leaning into that. And what's, of course, happened is that the Republicans, in the wake of the late 1960s, and the grievances that, frankly, came about as a result largely of their own policies, right? This is the arsonist pretending to be a firefighter, which is the move Trump perfected, but he didn't invent. That their policies create the problem, and then conservative populism does what demagogues always do and says, blame them.
Right.
The people who are different, people who are new to our country. And they play on culture war grievance politics rather than trying to solve the underlying economic issues that caused the problem in the first place.
Right.
And that's what Democrats need to do.
He recently wrote a long piece about the new centrism. I assume.
Yeah, I did see it. Of course,
looked at that. So, you have any comments on that? Is he on the right track? Is this even possible?
Well, look, my first book, as I mentioned, was a history of centrist leaders in American politics, and it spanned Teddy Roosevelt to the 2000 election, and it looked at how some succeed and others fail. I am always interested in where there is a possibility for bipartisan coalitions, because that's how America works best. I mean, even in divided government, I don't think divided government works the way it did when we had a strong center, and you saw the bell curve of election patterns in the Congress when we had liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, and for all the many problems that were created by that or perpetuated by that, you could always find a governing coalition if there was enough urgency. And I think that's something we need to recreate. I have a hard time. Again, I'm going back to the question of the judgment, not the motives thing. But guys like Josh Hawley, it's difficult to argue that they're arguing in good faith because of their personal actions. And smart guys like J.D. Vance, same thing applies. But if we can find common cause on issues that are about rebuilding the middle class, about strengthening American workers, then those are good conversations to have, and we absolutely should be having them because that's how American politics works. I think we want to be careful about a rush to protectionism, right? First of all the conservatives say I'm a free trader, then obviously you're not voting for Donald Trump, right? Because 10% tariff across the board. But reshoring essential manufacturing, that's just common sense. That's just wisdom, right? And the states should be competing, but we need to be reshoring essential manufacturing. That's a matter of national security as well as good economics.
So that's another area of overlap. Yeah. Yeah,
it absolutely is. And we need to take the pain of these declining, cities and communities seriously and invest in them. And that should be a matter of incentives and structural incentives for investing. We've forgotten, I think the fundamental wisdom, I came into politics inspired by Bill Clinton's 92 and 96 campaigns. And the basic third way idea, and I know this is very unfashionable and counter to Leonhardt's general argument, right? But I have a subscription to Blueprint magazine and an unabashed DLC third way stand, right?
Blueprint magazine, that's a blast for the past,
right? Oh yeah, I'm dropping that knowledge. Boom, drop that mic. Opportunity, responsibility, and community.
Yeah, ORC. That's what we used to call it back when I hung around with the DLC. ORC. But it was a great idea. Opportunity, responsibility. What the hell's wrong with that? It's
nothing.
Like a really good idea.
It's the right idea. That's my point. It's 100% the right idea. It's the right equation. And if we'd listened to it and followed through on it more, particularly the last piece, the last word doesn't get as much attention, community.
Right.
I think what Clinton was doing and what Tony Blair was doing was anticipating a lot of the forces that were forcing us apart that led to the rise of Trumpism, that we need to focus much more on what we can do to rekindle a sense of community. And some of these things are structural and some of them exist in the human heart. right? So, you don't want to, I don't believe in the perfectibility of society. Utopian dreams always end in nightmares. I don't believe in, break a few eggs to make an omelet. That's usually the excuse of dictators everywhere. But there are things we can do to work with human nature and market forces to incentivize things. And the sense of community is what's been lost. This isn't just a problem with bowling alone. There was a great headline I saw the idea around my friend Jonathan Haidt's book, Scrolling Alone. We need to counteract those things. Opportunity, responsibility, and community, still the right idea. And Democrats forget when they run down, they sort of look past the Clinton's legacy that before Bill Clinton, they lost 3 consecutive elections by more than 40 states.
I remember it well.
So I know you do, but this is where I'm happy to be countercyclical and try to rebuild energy around those ideas.
You've been very eloquent about the craziness and hyperpartisanship of the GOP under Trump. But to move in the direction you're talking about, I mean, look, hyperpartisanship isn't just something for the right. There's a significant amount of on the left, too. Do you see any green shoots here with people on the left starting to realize that maybe being so hyperpartisan isn't such a good idea? Or are we just stuck in, battle mode because of the campaign? I'm curious.
Look, I mean, this is a campaign. But the promise of this election is that we need to defend our democracy by defeating Trumpism, because it is a unique threat. And again, it's just because this is an election after January 6th, after an attempt to overturn the election on the back of a line. This is different, right? I can understand why people maybe wanted to take a flyer in 2016, and maybe they were defending the president of their party despite the disastrous record. And I ran a news organization, by the way, that was the first, I believe, one of the first to be blacklisted by the Trump campaign. Yes. Because one of Trump's flunkies threatened one of my reporters.
You were on the roll of honor.
You're damn right. And I was named in his lawsuit against CNN too. I take a backseat to nobody at standing up and criticizing Donald Trump, not personally, but because of the things he represents: the lies, the division, the hate, the dysfunction, the demagoguery. I'll do it every day, all day long. Mm-hmm. But the larger promise of this election is that we need this fever to break. Mm-hmm. That the hyper-partisan pitch of our politics doesn't represent the heart of our country, the better angels of our nature, or who we really are as a country. I did a segment not that long ago looking at the fact that we are far less divided than we think we are. You could take a couple of key issues that were hot-button issues a decade or two ago. Marriage equality.
Right. Yeah.
Marijuana. Right, exactly. These are 70% approval issues now, or more. Right? We are not as divided as we think we are. So what we need to do is have more energetic advocates for that idea who are willing to do the work to build on that common ground. And that does mean standing up. Bullies only respect strength. Mm-hmm. I think one of the lessons of the Trump years that a small number of people found out they could hijack at least one political party in a time of polarization through intimidation tactics. And they would either sway the weak-kneed to their side or cow other folks into silence. But I know that we are on the right side of history with this stuff if you study history. But we also need then to reach out, right? This is the point of Lincoln, the fight for peace. My book is about how you win the peace after winning a war. We're not in a war. We're not going to be in a second civil war. And God forbid, when anybody uses that iconography, remind them that, more than 500,000 Americans died. Don't play around with that BS. It doesn't make you tough. It makes you stupid. But we need to reach out. You need to be magnanimous in victory. We need to find ways to reunite our nation. That needs to be a number one job. We need to strengthen our democracy, and there are ways to do it. Not only election reforms, which are absolutely necessary, not only economic reforms, which are absolutely necessary, but we need to invest in civic education again, right? We need to, I think every graduating high school senior, and I said this at a naturalization ceremony I spoke at Mount Vernon, which is one of the great honors of my life. Every graduating high school senior should be able to take the same test that a naturalized citizen takes, the immigration test. That should be a baseline. Remind us, by the way, that immigrants are often the most patriotic and the most informed about our country.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And do things like take on disinformation. Digital disinformation is a threat to democracy. We need transparency around algorithms. We need to set the rules of the road. We need to take the lessons that Jonathan Haidt applies in his book, Smartphone-Free Schools, and other things. This is taking a toll on our democracy, and some of it's intentional. So we need to really have a whole of government approach on that. But yes, I think we need the fever to break, and then we need to build a politics based on common sense problem solving that is necessarily bipartisan. We need to reach out to the good people who are negotiating in good faith. And the really far right folks who are permanent residents of Crazy Town, who've gotten a lot of oxygen of attention out of constantly being outrageous, they need to be isolated. Give them their time. Ever just ignore them. Don't give them the oxygen of attention. This is a game they're playing with our country, but it's not a game. It's our country. We have one life. We have one country, and it is worth defending.
John, do you think that in terms of pushing this kind of politics forward and sort of in the process of isolating the far right, would it be helpful for, you hark back to the Clinton era, you loved the third way, a lot of what Bill Clinton's politics were about. Well, those were connected to an organization called the DLC, Democratic Leadership Council, which actually tried to promulgate a different approach to politics in the wake of all those presidential defeats that you alluded to. Do we need something like that today in the Democratic Party to instantiate common sense Democrats?
Yes, absolutely. And look, I think the New Democratic Coalition does a lot of great work. I think the Blue Dogs are incredibly important. Absolutely, though. It's not just a matter of counterweight. We're the last big tent political party in America that believes in bipartisanship. Right. And what I believe, at least here in Suffolk County, here on Long Island, the progressive activists are very pragmatic. They understand that if you don't win, probably because they've lost so many elections recently, that no good will come of it. Right. If your number one issue is the environment and you decide to go for purity over the pragmatism of someone who can win, you get nothing. The example I always remind people, particularly around this year's third party threats, there were 98,000 people in Florida in 2000 who thought that Al Gore wasn't good enough on the environment.
Right. Yeah.
And Bush won the state by 537. Madness. And they should hang their heads in eternal shame. First thing we do is pull out of Kyoto. So those absolutists are responsible for compounding the climate crisis we're in now. But equally here on Long Island, I believe the opportunity is to actually have combating climate change be a bipartisan issue. It's got 1,000 miles of coastland. Sure. Rising water levels don't give a damn if you're a Democrat or Republican. So that forces a degree of pragmatism. But what you also need to keep your eye clearly on is Republicans will talk a good game, but then their party will vote for cut funding Democrats have already allocated to combat climate change or do mitigation. So don't let them just, pretend that they're good on the issue. How do they vote? Don't listen to just how people talk. Watch what they do. But I absolutely do believe that. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a fan of what you all are doing under Liberal Patriot and what Common Sense Democrats. There are a lot of organizations. I've recently got the Common Sense Democrats endorsement. There are a lot of organizations that are working along these lines to work and win durable majorities because we need red state Democrats. We need rural Democrats. We need that's necessary for stable governing coalitions. And that means a big tent.
Not to mention the Senate.
and the Senate. Right? Everyone was hating on Joe Manchin.
Right.
Hating on Joe Manchin. So fashionable. Well, what happens when he leaves, folks?
Without Manchin, we would have been in a pickle.
100%. So all that hate that was directed at Joe Manchin, he got the ball down the field at the end of the day. I understand the frustration the folks felt at the time, but look at the results. And now that you don't have them, guess what? You miss them.
You miss them.
We need red state Democrats. Look at with the former governor of Montana. Wrote a great op-ed a little while ago about the need for red state Democrats. And I was working on a statement of principle. I'll share it with you. I haven't actually published this anywhere, but I just pulled it up.
I'd love to see it.
About Common Sense Democrats. And you'll recognize a line here. I'm just saying, what do we mean by that? Because I'm running as a Common Sense Democrat in Suffolk County. And I found out a couple other folks out here running as Common Sense Democrats. And actually, we formed a new party line called Common Sense about that. Common Sense Suffolk. Here's what I wrote. And I'm a writer, so, there's a little bit of tweaking here, but Common Sense Democrats are liberal patriots and pragmatic problem solvers. We defend democracy, stand up to extremism, and promote prosperity. We practice the politics of the golden rule. We believe in individual liberty, equal opportunity, and generational responsibility. We find common ground to pursue the common good. That was my first pass at that.
I love it. Yeah, I don't know how much more tweaking it needs. Anyway, this seems like a great note on which to end, John. I really thank you for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. And our listeners who are in New York won, June 25th the day, consider John.
Vote in the primary. You can support anywhere, which I will greatly help, but we want to put our ideas into action. And that's why I'm running for Congress.
That's what it's all about. Well, thanks again, John, and, good luck.
Thank you, my friend. Be well.